Every time we turn it up, it's workout. Feels good to do.
I wonder if everyone could take their seats so we can begin. Thank you so much. Oh, we haven't started yet. Okay. We're going to go ahead and call the meeting to order of the special Bloomington City Council Committee of the Whole to order. I apologize. Madam Clerk, would you call the roll?
Alderman Massey.
Here.
Alderman Sage.
Here.
Alderman Malavoy.
Here.
Alderman Burgess.
Here.
Alderman Painter.
Here.
Alderman Schmidt.
Here.
Alderman Black.
Here.
Alderman Hallman.
Here.
Alderman Bray.
Here.
And Mayor Renner.
Here. Thank you so much. We have, I think, unanimity does constitute a quorum. We next have public comment, and we have Angela Scott. Angela, would you please come forward? And do we have a sign-in sheet up there? No, we don't need, I have your address here. Thank you, Angela. And you have up to 3 minutes. Thank you.
I'm back. For those of you who didn't get my open letter, I left hard copies on the table back there for everyone. One item of note in that letter is that this is personal. I was born here. I'll probably die here. The city means a lot to me. I feel like the council might have some individuals who think this is a game, perhaps a video game where there aren't any consequences to your decisions. So I want to get up close and personal, and I'm going to name some names. Mrs. Burgess. You noted last week that Paw Patrol is a pretty big deal at your house. I thought, how nice that you and your child or children were going to go see that show. And I also wonder if you were going to feel good about yourself for supporting a local venue. But I have no question how my friends Gavin, age 4, and Noonie, age 5, feel. You see, they saw the big sign on the side of the Coliseum too. They don't get to go. They don't get to go because their families can't afford it. Their families will, however, be subsidizing you and your children. Let me explain. The council has final say and total responsibility for all the money that's collected by the city of Bloomington and how it's spent. And I don't care what pile the money falls in. If the mayor can borrow money to take his girlfriend to Japan, you can all certainly figure out ways to move money so that individuals and families aren't paying for non-essential venues like coliseums, sports complexes, or creativity centers that they can't use because they don't have the money to use it. Every time Gavin and Noonie's parents buy gas, non-grocery essentials, or eat at McDonald's, they are subsidizing things that they don't have the ability to use. These are families that work hard. They pay taxes. They do the best they can, and it's hard for me not to take that personally, and it should be hard for you not to take it personally when you represent these people. If you can't afford something, you can't have it. You don't buy it. That's how things work. Mrs. Burgess, I hope that you and your children enjoy that show. And while you're there, I hope that you think about Gavin's mom, who's working her second job and subsidizing your entertainment. If any of you approve another thing that the city cannot afford or that is not essential, you are taking food out of the mouths of children like Gavin and Noonie. You are. In my opinion, you're stealing from me, from my family, and from our neighbors. Please stop.
Thank you. At this point, we're going to go move to the approval of the Committee of the Whole meeting minutes from September 18th, 2017 and August 21st, 2017. Are there any motions for, are there any corrections to the minutes as presented? Is there a motion to approve these minutes as presented? Moved by Alderman Black, second by Alderwoman Bray. I assume that's a second?
Sure.
Okay. Madam Clerk, could you call the roll?
Alderman Mappy,
Yes.
Alderman Sage,
Yes.
Alderman Malumway,
Yes.
Alderman Burgess,
Yes.
Alderman Painter,
Yes.
Alderman Schmidt,
Yes.
Alderman Black,
Yes.
Alderman Hallman,
Yes.
Alderman Bray.
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. Minutes will stand. We move next to a presentation of our budget and long-term financial sustainability planning. And we have a presentation by Mr. Hales and Patty Lynn Silva and Melissa Hahn for approximately 15 minutes. And we have budgeted a council discussion for approximately 45 minutes. And this is our first public presentation and discussion about fiscal year 2019. And just for the record, we are currently in fiscal 2018. Our budget year runs from May 1st through April 30th. So I turn it over to Mr. Hales.
Thank you, Mayor. We're going to keep our presentations deliberately short tonight, but we hope in the process of doing so, we give you a very high-level picture and message of kind of what the projections are in the way of our structural imbalance in the city budget over the next 5 years, but also what are some possible ways where we do something a little different this year, in that rather than look at a short period of time, or 1 year, that we really begin a discussion of how are we going to address a multi-year long-term financial planning process to deal with some very significant high-level changes, not only in revenue, but in the local, state, and national economy, and how we're really going to deal with some, at times, gloomy projections of what it means to have a financial sustainability plan to provide consistent services in an era where we're not seeing the kind of revenue increases that we've seen in years past. So with that, I'm going to have Patty Lynn Silva, Finance Director, come up, make a brief presentation, followed by Melissa Hahn, Assistant to the City Managers on priority-based budgeting, and then I'll finish up to talk about some closeout comments, but then also to throw out some questions that I hope will lead to an interactive 45-minute process where you help us as we begin this process of looking at not just one, but the next 4 to 5 year budgets. So with that in mind, I'll turn to Patty for her initial presentation, followed by Melissa. Patty.
Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to present and have a pre-budget discussion. I'm very excited about this. Before I get started, I just wanted to mention that we have a new budget manager that's in the finance department. Scott Rathbun is here with us tonight, and he's been with us for a couple months. The budget...
Could you repeat his name for the record? I'm sorry.
Scott Rathbun.
Thank you.
So we kept the slide very short, and just for the record, the funding gap stems from our stagnant revenue projections versus our growing costs or projects or added capital that we are looking at. When we do a 5-year projection, we are very conservative. If our revenues have not grown, we're not going to predict that they do grow. Could they rally? They could, but we're not predicting that at this point, just to kind of give you the full flavor of where we could be. The general fund deficit that you see above you does include our commitments that we've made to both our debt service we currently have in our pensions. We have some subsidies to other funds, our rolling stock of vehicles and equipment. We have taken the liberty of adding, just for your information, a $1.5 million facilities maintenance line, which is the recommended average annual spend from the Fiscal and Gould report. If you remember the Fiscal and Gould master inventory, these projections also include the streets resurfacing program. What we don't have in here is added staff, any program enhancements, other capital needs, and we did hold our commodities and contractual lines down to a 1% increase per year, just to kind of, it's kind of an emergency type thing that you can do, and it represents about 25% of the budget. So the $3 million includes a $1.5 million add in expenditure for facilities maintenance. We had a similar problem in 18, I think if you remember, but we had some growth in the EAV, and we were able to capture about $500,000 for which we earmarked for emergency response times, if you recall. That has not yet been put into play, but as we look ahead right now, there is little to no growth in the EAV for this year. So the only way to capture more dollars on your tax levy would be to actually raise the rate. In 18, we had savings in debt service, and we also had the benefit of the expired Metro Zone agreement. So that saved $2.2 million. The departments also reduced their budgets by $2.7 million, and to have capital for facilities maintenance and wayfinding, we did take $2.2 million out of the health insurance fund as a one-time act to keep the facilities maintenance going. I think we have discovered that if we don't budget for that, it's going to come anyway throughout the year, just because of either ADA or as our facilities department continues to get out there and look around. So that's kind of the highlights of what we did in 18. So what our assumptions were, again, were that we have no rate increases, that we have no expected growth in revenue. We don't know how to really budget for federal, legislative, and state changes. During last year in 17, the federal government adopted a retroactive change. I think you've heard me mention that a couple of times for companies if they wanted to invest in large investments in equipment. So that allowed their estimated tax payments during the year to be less. So after we adopt our budget at the local level, we're still at the mercy, and of course the state budget, for these changes that become effective immediately or go retroactively. So we're not quite the masters of our own domain. And that's something that we always carry with us. So again, that's the reason we have the revenues at a very conservative level. We do not make any assumptions for reductions in the services or the workforce. I know our neighbors are looking at ERIs. That's something that's out there. And then again, we held...
And for the record, you could just clarify ERI.
Oh, I'm sorry. Early retirement incentives are being talked about, I think, at the county and at Normal publicly. And so those are things that we just, we kind of give you the non-policy version of the budget. And we do try to give you the worst case scenario so that we kind of can, but the way that our revenues fluctuate, we just don't know. So, and again, we held 25% of the budget to that 1%. This is where Melissa's going to kind of come up and talk about priority-based budgeting, which we have as a tool this year, which we haven't had in the past, which I think would be very helpful for us.
Good evening. So just really quickly, I know you're getting a lot of information from me on a weekly basis. So I just very quickly wanted to talk about the list that you have in your packet. So what was included in there was a list of the programs that was part of the draft that you received last March. But I did kind of reorganize the programs in that list, so I just wanted to point that out in the list that you have in your packet. Those programs are sorted first by priority level as determined by the department directors and their staff, and then by mandate level to kind of help you look at those two things. And then you've also got in there what department and the program name is also included in there. And then I just wanted to give you some numbers to start with as you kind of begin to look through these programs in preparation for the budget. So far, 160 programs have been identified. Of those 160, 109 were determined to be high priority. Once again, this was determined by each of the departments. 77% of those 109 are mandated. 40 were identified to be a medium priority. 55 of those are mandated. And of the total 160 programs, 45 were identified as having a current service level as fair or poor. So it kind of begins to help us to start to look at what are those priority levels. So what do we want to offer, and then how well do we want to do that? At what service level? Just a couple reminders. Priority-based budgeting is about what to keep. So as you look through those programs, what do you feel best aligns with the priorities of the community? And what should we keep and what should we continue to offer? And then also just that a reduction in labor as we start to talk about the upcoming budget is also a reduction of either programs and or service levels. So we need to continue to keep that in mind as well. And then I just wanted to give you a couple questions to consider as you use this material in preparation of the budget. The first one, should the city continue to offer all 160 programs? And remember, as I said, this is just kind of the first scratch of the surface. We're still working to kind of do that deeper analysis to really start to get in and look at actual cost of each program. So there may actually be, by the time we're done, there could be more programs as we're really, critiquing and defining that as we go through the process. And then should service levels be adjusted to align with the resources available? If it's a program we definitely want to keep, do we make adjustments to that service level to fit in with the resources we have available? And finally, should we align the fee for the service or program with the cost to provide it? And I just wanted to briefly throw out an example as I've been working with the communications center. Our current ordinance that we have for false alarms allows for the first 4 false alarms to be responded to at no charge. So if you have an alarm system, you get your first 4 at no fee that the communications center as well as the police are responding to. And then after the first 4, you're assessed a $50 fine for each violation after that. So in 2014, we had 329 false alarms. We had 232 false alarms in 2015 and 235 false alarms in 2016. So over the last 3 years, we've potentially had about 3,184 false alarms that were not assessed a fee that we're responding to. So as we get in and look at these programs and start to consider those costs, once again, we want to remember that priority-based budgeting is about what to keep and what do we want to do and what level of service do we want to provide. So any questions for me?
Questions for Melissa?
I do have a question.
Alderwoman Schmidt.
Sometimes when I'm looking at your priority budgeting briefs, I'll look at, and I can't find one right in front of me now, of course, but I'll see something that's a high priority, and I wonder, are there ways to unpack that so that maybe we're not managing all of it? I mean, some of these feel like they're big strategic areas, and are there parts of it that maybe are not as high priority as another, or might be handled by somebody not in the city, or
Sure.
How do you work your way through that?
Well, currently with what we have, as I said, so this was just kind of our first initial, scratch of the surface, and so we are getting into, really starting to break that down, working with the departments to look at, what is a program, because it's really going to vary by department. So we want to start looking at, a program shouldn't be a division, but it shouldn't be as small as a work task. So it's kind of like finding that spot in the middle of defining what that program is. And so in this next round that the departments are currently working on, we're going to be looking at, have there been getting a little bit more objective instead of being so subjective with just selecting high, medium, and low. We're going to be looking at, has there been a change in the request of the service? Have there been more users wanting it, fewer users, looking at the mandates and verifying those, and is it a mandate that's federal or state, or is it a mandate that we institute upon ourselves, either through code or ordinance. So that's going to kind of, help define that better as well when we're looking at kind of breaking those things down. So we will continue to do that as we move through the process. Mm-hmm.
Alderman Massey and then Miller-Wampway.
I had a question. Just what's the preferred way you want us to ask questions? So for instance, some of the things that are on the list that we got, I'm not sure what's all involved in that particular line item. As a for instance, just because it happens to be up here right now, is mail services from the clerk's office. If I wanted to ask a question, say what's all included in this program, to get more details, is there a preferred method you want us to use? Should I ask Jerry directly, or should I go through you, or?
No, I can definitely provide that information, and we do have each program is defined, and so I can get you all of that, the entire packet that was put together back in March. So I can get that for you. It will provide the breakdown for each department, what each of the programs are, the description, how they've been rated as far as mandate, priority, service level.
Okay, perfect. So, thank you.
Yep.
And as we're going through, essentially, Patty Lynn and David and I have kind of talked about this being an unusual, in fact, totally unique budget process, probably for any of us up here, and that is we're going to have one city manager and a finance director who helps prepare some of the budget, and then an interim city manager and the same budget director who helps us get through this process to be presented by early February. And so as I get information, I'm happy to share that with the council, because I did say that, in the past I have not used a line item veto, but that might be necessary this time. So I want to know, if I ever use line item veto, what I'm doing, and I want that to be very surgical. So I'm happy to I will be collecting that information as well. So I'm happy to share that, and I may be getting much of that from Melissa, who sits next door to me.
And Mayor, if I could, we can certainly keep asking some questions, but maybe if I could kind of wrap things up, because the whole 45 minutes is going to be for council discussion and questions. So I didn't know if we wanted to continue with maybe one more question, and then I'll wrap everything up in 15 minutes to kind of set the stage for your discussion of this whole topic, which might be of some help.
Okay. Alderman Miller-Wampway?
Sure. And my question is also a process question, and I guess how you came to define, the service level, right, to and decide what's excellent, what's fair or good. So I'd like to get an insight into, who are the people involved? Is it just people within that department, or is it a combination of the department, central administration, but also, how do you decide, what measures do you use to decide what's fair and what's good? Just want to get an insight into that.
Sure. So for this first round, it was completely done by the department directors and their staff. So that's where we're receiving the input from. And we asked them to rate it either excellent, that they felt the program exceeded standards. Now those could be set by the department, or they could be national standards if they have national standards that they're kind of benchmarking against. Good would be that you're meeting standards. Fair would be we're meeting some standards, but there's some room for improvement. And then obviously poor, we're not meeting the standards that we should be. So with this first round that we did, as I said, it's been somewhat subjective, and we're working on putting together a system where there's more criteria involved they'll be looking at to score each of those programs. And then as we move down through the process, hopefully we'll be getting council involved as well in that discussion.
Anything else? Alderman Blatt.
Thank you. Thank you for putting this together. I've enjoyed those weekly memos. It's been, we cast out for this a couple years ago, and it's taken a lot of different forms, but I think it does a good job of, I'm talking about priority-based budgeting, showing the council kind of what our decisions impact and doing it in a methodical way, which I appreciate. You talked in the beginning about this is more of a function of trying to see what you want to keep versus what you want to get rid of, and we can think about it that way. And for me, I think as I look at the next year's budget and future budgets, number one priority for me is how do we combine and consolidate services, and if that comes in the form of technology, how do we maybe use our My Bloomington app to pay for things? How does that impact our ability to reduce postal costs for sending our bills elsewhere to Kansas to come back over here? Those are the types of things that I'm thinking about. How do we become flatter? The conversations that I hear in the community are that people perceive, accurately or not, that it seems like the city can be quite top-heavy. We have a lot of administration, we have a lot of directors, and the frontline stuff doesn't get done. And either that's a challenge with us having to educate the public on all of the work that our staff does, which is fantastic, or making it leaner, more in line with what people wanted to see. And I don't know if at some point down the road we can see this document where I can interact with it, where I can click on it and see more details. What ordinance am I referring to? When it's done by ordinance. What federal state mandate that might be. And I'll continue to say that my top priority before I leave this seat is that I want to make sure that when people call 911 on their cell phones, that they don't have to get transferred to a different to Bloomington. That's ridiculous. That's a safety issue. Year after year, we see more and more people getting rid of their landlines. This is the stuff that I think that we should be focusing in on, because perhaps that may cost us more money. It may save us money. We may be able to recoup some of those E911 fees. I'm not sure, but that's a life safety issue, top priority for this council. That's a way that we can start to combine services, work with our intergovernmental partners, and that to me is the number one priority. And I see it up here as at the top of our list here. So it's nice to see that we can agree on that piece, but that's more of a how than a what. That said, looking kind of at the future, it seems these days everything is very uncertain. I don't see much stability coming out of the federal government, either in terms of policy specifics or really anything. I have zero faith in our state leaders of producing anything that comes in any semblance of direction. So, when we look back at our assumptions, I'm almost thinking they're going to find ways to kind of scoop more money out. So it creates a bleak picture, and the projections for our community of are we growing, are we shrinking? I mean, I'm going to just like to think flatline is my ultimate goal, because I don't know any other way of looking at it. So we got to prepare for those sorts of things. And the irony becomes is that when economic hard times hit, people look to government to help them out with programs and whatever that might be. So how do we prepare for that? And I guess as I look at budget models for this next cycle, I almost want to break our budget. What's it going to take? What can the state do to us to really sink our ships? What do we get out of the business of? What does that model look like? Because I continue to hear that people are not responsive to, are not appreciative of the city saying we can't do this or we have to wait a few more years. I hear things like, my street hasn't gotten addressed in years. I see more and more development on the east side of our community. Where's our economic development in our historic core? We talk about, multi-sports complexes, but O'Neill Pool hasn't been done in forever. I mean, these are types of public service things that we do that we need to be addressing and at least respond to the public, because those things are not going to go away. That feedback isn't going to go away. And in many ways, this next year's budget cycle for me is looking to be the most frightening because of all the uncertainty at the federal and state level, but also just the fact that our projections are flat. Things are not looking as rosy as we'd like them to be. And I want to, as this body, to encourage a different direction where we can show the stability, where we can encourage the growth, and do what we can to make our community a better place. And I'm looking forward to our conversation. I'm sorry it takes so much time. Looking forward to our conversation, because if we think about it in terms of what we want to keep, then that means at the end of the day there are some things that we don't want to keep. And I'm hoping that we can talk about that. And I've thrown some things out here myself, and looking forward to hearing my colleagues' thoughts.
Thank you. Mr. Hales, did you want to finish up?
Yes, and Melissa, if you were Patty, I want to go back to show Patty's 5-year projection. Let's leave that up for the rest of this discussion, because a couple of final points I want to make really come back to this. First off, let me just remind everyone, the city ordinances, I think for a reason, have put a lot of primary responsibility, role, delegation to the city manager to make sure that once each year, city manager brings to you a balanced budget for your consideration. However, that's just looking at an annual budget. The problem is we're going to continue to talk about is this is an ongoing multi-year issue that we're facing, but we're not facing it alone. I think we're seeing a very unusual dynamic in that changing economics, including internet sales and many other factors, have really caused many, many cities throughout the state to see the revenue flattening out. But our labor costs continue to go up. And when you look at this, if you ask, well, what's the single most cause of this increase year after year, it's labor costs, salaries and benefits exceeding revenue projections. Now, we hope that maybe those revenue projections will moderate and maybe improve, but as you look at, examples like Peoria, $8 million deficit, and Normal, the county, looking at early retirements incentives. Most of these governmental entities are saying, you know what, we've got to get a better handle on the costs. The problem with always cutting to balance that budget is, well, what impact does that have on public safety and health? On the other hand, I think we'd all agree that you can't tax your way year after year after year and just keep raising revenue without demonstrating to the public that we're trying to be more efficient, we're trying to be more effective, and to me, part of effective is, as you look at these programs, when was the last time we did a review, which is part of what priority-based budgeting is, what was the original purpose of that program? What were we trying to achieve? What was the results we hoped to gain? And have we ever gone back and say, did we ever achieve that? Is it still relevant today? It's 160 programs today, but before we're all said and done, it could be 200. It could be 300. Because again, we, as with most programs right now, what we're finding is that the staff is continuing being asked to manage an excess of programs at a level that their performance level is less than ideal because there's too many. There's no way even existing staff right now can perform and to provide the level of service, an optimum level of service for all these programs that we currently have. And I think that's a critical point. We need to make sure we understand. Unfortunately, that is a terrible morale buster because the expectations the citizens have of you, citizens have of us, is, well, why can't you provide the ultimate in service, ultimate in customer service? We want things now, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact is, we don't have enough personnel to deliver excellent service for each and every one of these programs, which kind of comes back to what role does the council want to play? If anything, as we look at long-term financial planning, which is more of a multi-year plan of action by using priority-based budgeting, by looking at programs, by looking at what is going to be the core programs we focus on, what are we going to do with the labor costs, which are a critical element of these increases. How do we deal with that constant growing imbalance in revenues and expenditures? That is something that you're not going to decide on, in one meeting. Let me just give you a quick overview of what we are going to be doing and what I hope that you would support in the way of a few action plans. In a few days, we'll have a budget kickoff with the directors. The finance director and Scott, as the budget manager, is going to be giving each of the directors operating budget targets. We showed you a picture, I think it was back in the fiscal year 2017 budget summary, where there was some very significant cost savings achieved in the general fund last year. We are looking at what the historical trend has been on operating costs, and we're going to ask the directors to have their budget target, line item, and cumulative total based more on prior year historical actuals as opposed to what they think they need. Because what we've been seeing time and time again is the budget numbers have been high enough to where we're just consistently keep coming back with savings. And I think that's indicative of, again, we're asking too few number of people to do too much. They can't do it. They cannot even spend, the money we're providing. So one, on the operating side, you're going to see a much more managed, a much more tighter budget process. And that doesn't mean the directors, they'll have flexibility. They can justify and recommend an increase, but they're going to have to justify it. It can't just be opinions. That, I think, is going to be a significant help in this next year's budget and hopefully beyond. Secondly, you have in front of you a fee and service charge policy. This goes back to, some of you might require the Fiscal choice. I think it was a consultant who came back and showed that there was a potential for $1 million plus in savings that could be realized if some of the programs we currently have, many with existing fees, maybe the fees were increased. Unfortunately, we lack a policy. We lack a policy decision on whether or not those programs should be 100% cost recovery or something less than that. But most important, we lack the resources to institute this program and to have it be something that occurs on a year in and year basis. I think the big challenge we've had is who do we delegate this to when no one has additional capacity and time? So I think going back to what we've already done, and institute that program is critical, because all these 160 programs, when was the last time either staff or the council looked at them and decided, you know what, if these are more of a private benefit, why shouldn't the beneficiary be required to pay a fee? And the council can decide if it's 100% or less in the way of recovery. We also want to continue other items. Now, as Melissa was saying, the directors have prioritized these programs right now. Ultimately, I think the council needs to do that. We can help, you can have ad hoc committees, things of that nature, but ultimately, that's a decision for the council. And I think, hopefully, we all realize the government can't do everything it has been. For 8 years, I've seen this government say whenever there's been a proposal to reduce something in the way of service or program, it hasn't happened. And I think this shows you, once again, that we've got to come up and start saying no, because that is the toughest thing for an employee to say. No to the director, no to the city manager, no to the mayor and the council, and elected officials to say no to the citizen. But, which brings up another key point, we've got to engage the citizens. They are the ones through, I think, so much of the outreach and satisfaction surveys and opinion surveys have said, what's their number one need? What's their number one priority? It's infrastructure, infrastructure, and infrastructure. And I think that's a hallmark of good budgeting, that we constantly make sure that we inform the public and we ask them what they feel their needs are, and then we follow through with that. One final thing is, as I look, if anything, I think another reason, and it's unfortunately kind of a product, an outgrowth of our master planning, but for decades, the city was negligent in not taking care of what we had, what we owned, whether it was streets, sidewalks, utilities, et cetera, et cetera. Where did the money go? It went to help subsidize new residential growth. We're not going to get out of this for decades, but when we look at all these other capital needs, I can come back to you and show you, well, before you spend on anything new, have we truly come up with a financial plan to maintain what we have? And I would say we're still not there. And yet, there's still discussion about building new, and things. Now, some things have to be replaced, like O'Neill, and things like that. I mean, how long can you put major Band-Aids on those? So, with that, I'll start with where I added. The city manager, the finance director, budget manager, directors, we can come back with this plan, a budget plan that's going to be balanced in mid-February, or the council can elect to come up with some pre-budget financial policies, some directives. You can take a strong role, but it's almost, I think the big challenge is, where do you start? And up to now, you've seen staff really carrying that heavier burden. So hopefully, for what time's remaining, hopefully you'll have discussion. What part do you want to play? I would hope you keep your discussion at a high level, because you've got to start talking about programs and major services because of the labor cost element. If the minute you start getting into the line item and the detail, nickel and diming, you're not going to touch what this trend is showing. And that is, we're facing significant structural imbalances in the years ahead, and it's going to take significant and challenging, tough political decisions, to begin to avoid that, and it's going to be painful for us and the citizens as well. So with that, let me turn it, Mayor, back to you and the council. We'll be happy to answer any questions and to help you as we begin that long-term financial planning process.
Thank you, and thank you, Patty, Lynn, Melissa, for all the work that you've been doing for this. It's very important for us. One of the types of things I think that would be helpful, for example, would be if we have kind of a macro level reform like an early retirement incentive program, an ERI, how would that disproportionately affect the different departments? Because we know that it's not going to be equal across all departments. And so things like that would be, in a sense, what I would refer to as the distributional effects of a reform like that would be useful for us to know, as we go forward. So we understand what we're doing, what we're not doing. Alderwoman Burgess.
Mayor, could I just, one follow-up? And I do think that's a critical, because that gets at labor, but I'll just share with you, I was talking with another local official, and he was saying, once you come up with a plan, then you kind of set a target of how many you hope would take advantage. If they don't take advantage, then are we prepared to say, then it'll be layoffs. It'll no longer be voluntary. And then the last is, will we create a vacancy that we won't fill? Now, again, you can get a certain element of savings even if you hire someone at a lower salary scale. But some of these other cities that I mentioned are also looking at reducing their workforce for maximum savings, which may eventually what we have to look at. So thanks.
And then just to clarify for the record, and I think the entire council that's here certainly knows that, is that back in early 2009, we had an FTE of approximately 850 employees, correct? And we are approximately 750 now. So it doesn't mean that we can't cut more. It just means, and one of the great things about the budget task force that several, and Alderman Matthew served on before he was alderman, is pointing out for us that there are no golden gooses out there. There's not, whatever metaphor you want, pot of gold. There are going to be very difficult structural changes, very difficult things that we have to move forward. And on many of those things, most of the major things we found out we weren't going to save anything, or might even cost us money for privatizing golf courses and things like that. So we certainly have tracked down many of those items. And so anyway, was going to start out with Alderwoman Burgess, and then Schmidt and Howman.
Thank you. And I was recently reading a study, I think it was by the Paul Simon Institute at SIU,
which was exploring a dichotomy in the public perception. And I'll sum it up the best I can, which was basically that the public wants to cut in order to improve our government resources and our government financials, but when asked to identify an area to cut, there is no clear area to cut. And I think that this is based on this idea, this notion, or even this myth that there is a quick and easy way to cut ourselves to prosperity, that there is some pool of inefficiency that if we just had the willpower, we could easily eliminate it and all our problems would be solved. What my experience on council is telling me, and what that study concluded to, was that that does not exist. And that means that we on council will face the very difficult task of making decisions we know will be unpopular. It will either have to increase revenues in some manner, or we will have to cut programs that are very popular and that the public believes are an essential portion of what we do. So there are no easy answers here. Most likely it will be a combination of those items, as well as something we've talked about as a council, which is this notion of growing the local economy, that our path to someday having a fiscally sustainable budget is to grow the economy and then to capture that growth. But, and maybe Patty Lynn can give us some updates on this, I'm very concerned because at the state level, there's been repeated conversations about capping the property tax, which would potentially, depending on how they do it, prohibit our ability to capture growth within the community. So we saw in the presentation last year, one way we helped balance the budget was to capture growth, which even though we didn't increase the property tax rate, we were able to increase our property tax levy. In fact, I think my memory is we actually decreased the property tax rate slightly.
The only reason I want to clarify this is because there's always a misunderstanding. Every time we talk about taxes, we have not increased property taxes in the city of Bloomington since 2008. So they've actually gone down slightly. I mean, it would be not accurate to say we really cut taxes, but it might be like $4 one year, $3 another year. But essentially, we've kept them flat. So the growth is because we've had once we had a full year of Hy-Vee, we were in better shape. Once we had a full year of Ovation Cinema, we had more money coming in. So I just want to clarify that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you for doing that because it's very, very important. And I think that's what gets us into trouble sometimes is I believe that at the state level, it's incredibly popular to talk about a property tax freeze without understanding what that truly means. If it's not done properly, we will have less money over time. We're not going to maintain the status quo. We're actually going to have less money over time if they freeze the levy instead of the rate. So that's an overriding concern we have because then all of our efforts to improve the local economy, grow our tax base, will really not get us any measurable benefits depending on what the state does. So I think if there's two things I hope that we can keep in mind is number one, it's not going to be easy, and number two, we need to continue to advocate for ourselves at the state level.
And probably one of the first rules of politics in the land of Lincoln is you can't trust Springfield. Alderwoman Schmidt.
David, about a month ago, I think when we were talking about the budget, you suggested that we might consider an ordinance looking at hiring. I don't know if it's an ordinance or a policy, so that we would not automatically just be filling any position at any level. I'm assuming public safety would be exempted from that. And I think that's a very good idea, and I wonder where we are, is that something that we can pursue as a strategy that down the road helps our labor costs?
Yeah, I think that was one of the options I threw out, and if the majority of the council would like, we could draft that, bring it back to you to formalize that.
Would you like an alderman's request form for that? Would that give you...
Sure, just even if a majority tonight were to approve that, we'll draft something, bring it back. I will say this, I would be cautious about exempting public safety, because when you see this increase over 50%, I can't remember the exact number, but it's probably higher than that, 60-70% of that increase is probably tied to public safety. So, and that doesn't mean that you just don't hire right away, but even public safety would have they'd have to justify that increase, because it's the other thing I look at is it's just like this year with all the collective bargaining agreements we've entered into. This is a year where we didn't have extra money to pay any of those.
Right.
And so what's the result? dip into savings, looking for one-time money. And sooner or later, you've got to say, well, that can help immediately, but what about the long term? So, but
Well,
yes, we can.
And I think
bring
one benefit of doing that, of course, is that it forces all of us to really examine what we're doing, and it fits in with Melissa's work very nicely. I also want to say that I certainly hope we're not going to be talking about raising revenue or taxes unless we have a serious conversation first about some cutting, because we've been pretty good at raising taxes and fees, so I'm not interested in that.
Alderman Howman.
Thank you. I just have a couple of comments, and one to echo what Alderman Burgess said about economic development. At IML, they were talking about economic development being one way to reduce or control taxes, because I would be cautious if I were talking about ERIs, because that's just going to start a rumor mill. I think that's maybe part of our conversation, but I can just hear it tomorrow morning. The employees saying, "I wonder if we're going to have jobs." So I think that needs to until we have a better handle on it. And Mayor, earlier this year, we talked about a committee with council and residents to look at. I thought about looking at the expenses that we could get input not just from council and staff, but from some city residents as well. Is that still a possibility?
Certainly that's a possibility. I think there was some suggestion of do we have another budget task force? My thought initially was, at this point, I think we have citizens' representatives at this point as a budget task force, the city council. That doesn't mean that I'm certainly not open to something else if you've got a specific idea. But absolutely, if you've got something specific, we had a specific charge at a specific time back in 2015. That was May 5th or so, whatever it was, of 2015, and a specific timetable where we had 3 members of council plus 6 members of the community. The chamber got 2 people to put on as well, out of that group of 9. So if you've got a specific charge, I'd be interested in hearing that. Obviously, we're going to have conversations with citizens. The question is what kind of structural arrangement, if I'm understanding your question, would we put into place?
Yeah, because now we have, when the budget task force was meeting, we didn't have the priority-based budgeting information, which I think probably would have been a big asset, I'm just guessing, to the committee to work on, or to work with. And I understand we had some heavy hitters on the budget task force. I'd like to see some folks that are some citizens who are truly interested in the budget and keep bringing us suggestions and say, okay, let's see where some of these go.
And another thing that we could conceivably have within all departments, whether or not it be at the golf courses or here at City Hall or in other places, is just even a general suggestion box, and see whether or not sometimes those suggestions are things that are going to be very good. Sometimes they're maybe not even doable.
Well, and employees often have ideas that we don't necessarily.
A suggestion box wouldn't mean just citizens, right?
Yeah, I'm saying employees often have ideas that we don't necessarily get to tap into because they're reluctant to bring them forward or whatever.
Right, and I would think that any series of suggestion boxes could be either anonymous or with contact information if that person chose to put their name and contact information down. Alderman Black.
Thank you, and I appreciate the compliment of me being a heavy hitter, although I don't think that I would constitute it.
People from the community.
People from the community.
She didn't mean you.
Oh, good, because I would not. Yeah, no way. Yeah, I mean, just some thoughts here is that what's really interesting to me, as we have this conversation, is how we decide. And in the past, we've done these March Saturday meetings where we have all the directors come up here and kind of give a 5-minute presentation about what they've cut and what it looks like. And while that's nice and it provides some information, what I'm really hearing from both this group and the public is they want kind of a higher level budget sooner than later so we can really dissect it, really talk about it, and maybe it turns into we have a couple work sessions where we just focus on one department and those interested parties, and I, again, keep thinking of the summer of Zumba. If we start cutting specific programs, we hear from people, what does that look like? We can ask the questions, and there's time to react. There's time for staff to provide it. Because a lot of times, the sense I get from people is there's a frustration that it's like, I threw a good idea out there, but it was never really taken seriously. But I also hear a lot of ideas that are kind of, I don't want to say half-baked, but they're just not all there. And like for instance, and no disrespect at all, but like the fire alarm, the alarms that we were talking about earlier for when police calls, those go off. I've had a conversation with the resident. What constitutes a false alarm? If you have somebody, kid rattling your window, checking to see if it's locked or not, and that sets off the alarm. There's no evidence that it truly was that's what occurred or did not occur. Do we really want to charge citizens for taking extra precautions in their home? And, getting that deeper dive, I think, is what when we talk about those sorts of things is important to me. And if we break it up over a longer period of time, and maybe we don't do a Saturday session or we do multiple Saturday sessions where we invite people to weigh in specifically on a topic, we could address those in a more meaningful way. And, my frustration has been in the past that, we'll hear aldermen say we want to make cuts, but I don't really hear specifics about those. And what I want to hear is, we can make a cut, or this is how we do it, and this is what the impact would be from staff's perspective, whether it be personnel, whether it be service level, whatever it might be. And David, very quickly, every so often I hear in the public people get upset about pension spiking. Can you comment on pension spiking and the current status in the city of Bloomington?
Yeah, the big, I would, estimate that the biggest impact on us on that, the area of, let's see, what was the other term we use? What was the term, Patty, that IMRF used to some of those big payouts we had to pay? Pardon? Accelerated payment. I'll use that term.
Okay.
The great majority of people that impact have retired. We do still have some, but it's not necessarily I don't think it's going to amount to the kind of costs like we've already got behind us, because so many of them have retired. The people who remain are a little younger. They don't have maybe as much money attributed there, but if I can, I think one an example is, well, maybe I won't. Some cities, in fact, I remember listening to the general counsel of IMRF. When IMRF was faced with what to do on this potential for pension spiking, they prohibited. The executive director prohibited, period. That wasn't what we did, but again, in the interests of equity, fairness, people who had come and gone, but, it's tough choices that have to be made in some of those. But I will say this, though, too, because it ties back to the other comment. We still have a large portion of our employed labor pool that are little baby boomers. So if you get into early retirement sort of programs, there is still interest out there. But of course, some of the interest is, can you offer the same program that the city did in 2008? And there's no way. I think we should ever. That financially cost us, probably $8 to $10 million. When you compare that with what the Normal and the county are offering, it's much, much more limited. But still, I think that is a potential area to encourage some people with much reduced kind of level of incentive.
But to my recollection, new employees of the city do not have that option.
Exactly, yeah, we phased it out for all the new employees.
Exactly, so that is something that has been dealt with and resolved, and it's one of those things that we don't need to continue to hear about.
Right, just again, for the record, that's the main point.
Yeah.
2012, we ended that for employees moving forward. Alderman Sage.
Thank you. Karen, I'll just echo in what you said. this idea that we're going to look at revenue increases and let's call that what that is, tax increases, before having before identifying specific cuts to go along with that. That's a non-starter for me. So appreciate you saying that. And Diana, I will echo what you say too. My concern about any type of an ERI program is first what David just mentioned was the cost. Which is why I was against it back then, because we weren't able to cost justify it, you know. But secondly, I'm afraid that becomes just a technique to kind of kick the can down the road again. If we lose staff because of an early retirement incentive effort, but we don't do the right thing about reducing the services and the programs that are in place, all we're doing is, we're not doing anything. That's window dressing. It's a charade. All we're doing is just exacerbating the existing situation that we have. So I appreciate you bringing that up, because I think it's a good point. Finally, what I wanted to say was just I appreciate what staff has continued to do over the last few years, and the department heads that are here. I've sat and watched staff do what I think is a yeoman's job in terms of looking at things like debt refinancing and doing some work addressing our health care costs. And those are just a couple of things that come to mind. Staff has been telling us, and we knew this starting back when the sales tax increase was passed, that we had approximately about a 3-year window, and we're here. And so staff has, in my opinion, done the things to try to help reduce expenses, but the reality is that they simply can't. Staff cannot keep up with the natural progression and growth of the policy decisions that are in place from the council. And so the day of reckoning is at hand. And so, David, I think one of the questions you asked was, would you rather, for me personally, I guess I'd rather see this council more involved with the heavy lifting now and trying to lead and govern as the board should. Because I've seen staff again try to address a number of these things over the last few years, but we reached a point where those two things are no longer running in parallel, right? Our ability to reduce expenses at the staff level with some of the changes and efforts that we've done have worked well, but the cost curve is not bending, right, to keep track with that. So I would welcome the chance to be involved in not like I was in 2015 with the budget task force, because I've kind of been there and done that. But I certainly would want to be part of a council conversation to help the council do what we need to be doing right at this point. So thanks.
Essentially, yes. If we, in line with what everyone has really said, if we wait until that council discussion in March, it's over. Right. The budget's been put together by February. And so we're mainly reacting, or we're talking about very specific things at the margins. And I do have to say that, I think I'm certainly optimistic with our current council. I think everybody seems to be ready to roll up their sleeves, so to speak, to get into this, to give positive feedback moving forward, not to dump an impossible task upon our staff. And I think that that's important. No one on our current council has gone on and on and on pontificating, as we've had in previous councils, where there was no substance. There were no tangible things that we could actually do. Now we're poised, I think, to make some real progress in our budgetary policy, and that doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but I think at this point, the days of rhetoric are over, the days of action are here. Any other questions or comments? Alderman Burgess.
Just a quick question, so I want to make sure I'm not missing something. 2 people have now spoken out against tax increases. Is there any proposal right now that we increase taxes, or is this just a general philosophy?
I was reacting to your comment about looking at a mix of revenue increases and program cuts, and I'm not ready to have a conversation about revenue increases until we have the serious conversations about looking at our programs. So I'm just setting where I am with those conversations.
Okay, thank you. And let me clarify my comment. I was referring to revenue increases through capturing future growth. So I want to make it clear, I'm not suggesting that we raise taxes. I don't want any misunderstanding there. Thank you.
Okay. Especially at this point, just to clarify for the record, over the last 6 fiscal years, it's not, we have raised taxes or fees, regardless of how you want to do it, every other year. Every year our taxes and fees, every year our costs have gone up. It is only every other year that we have attempted to try to recapture some of those costs. And so that has not been our only fallback, just again, for the record, because we're taxpayers too. And we pay those taxes and fees as do others. And we've tried to be, I think, strong fiscal managers of that, and so certainly have our staff. And I want to thank a special shout out to Patty Lynn and David, Steve Rasmussen, Melissa, to all the great work you've done over time. And certainly one of the areas that is also cross-cutting, and by cross-cutting I mean it's not in a specific department like ERI, and that is the fees, studies of fees. When I was on the county board, I think it was somewhere around 2002, we did a fee study. There hadn't been an analysis of fees, I think at that point, in like 30 years. And we did pay $100 and some thousand, I believe, for a fee study that people complained about, but we wound up saving well over $1 million a year in actual changes to the cost. We were not recapturing costs, whether it was marriage licenses or whatever it was. We were pricing those things at a time where Gerald Ford was president, and we were in a time where George Bush II was president. So those are some things that I think we also may want to try to examine. Thank you again for pointing that out. But again, that may be something that will be something that will cut across perhaps even all departments. Thank you. Other comments? All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. This is only the beginning of a very exciting conversation, regardless of how this all turns out. We're going to move on to a discussion. We have a brief presentation of the city manager recruitment process. We're going to start out by hearing from our current city manager, David Hales, and Nicole Albertson, our Human Resources Director, for 10 minutes, and then have approximately a 20-minute council discussion. And just so that the audience understands, after that, we will recess into executive session for a specific discussion of possible internal candidates for the interim city manager position. That's under the item 7 executive session. So right now, this is the public discussion of the overall process that we're going to be going through, or likely, depending on council's opinion, of a city manager recruitment process. So, Nicole, I'm going to turn it over to you. Or David, you want to start?
Just very briefly, yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole. I just thought that with any process like this, and being part of recruitment processes in the past as a candidate, but as well as internally when we've hired people, I think what you have tonight to look at is probably that very first critical step, and that is, do you want to hire someone to assist you in that recruitment process? And what you'll find is where a lot of councils do start is they issue an RFP, they get a number of proposals in, and then the council interviews those, probably a short list. And it's during that time when you really develop kind of what you want to see in that process. And but I think tonight what we tried to provide you, and Nicole and Jeff did really the heavy lifting here, is some information on an RFP. One particular consultant gave us a quick little rundown of some of the process. So with that, I think at this point in time and here on out, I'll just turn it over to Nicole to kind of share with you what's been put together and see if there's some consensus as to how you want us initially to proceed, or Nicole and her staff to proceed on this hiring process.
Okay, thank you. So as David said, we wanted to share with you some thoughts on the external permanent recruitment process for the city manager. Obviously, you know that we'll be talking about the interim process, so this is just the initial part of the permanent recruitment process. In your materials, though, I want to highlight you do have a draft RFP. Some of the material in there has already changed in terms of dates of the timeline, and that's what we're going to talk about a little bit, and then what next steps we want to see in the overall recruitment. All right, so as you can see here on the slide, we're going to walk through what our initial timeline is for the process. Assuming you are all in agreement to go the RFP route, we will start that process immediately, as soon as tomorrow. Carla Murillo is our procurement manager, took over for John Johnston. She and I and Jeff have already been meeting, so we're ready to take that on right away. We think a good deadline for that would be November 10th. It gives vendors just a little under 3 weeks to respond to the RFP. We would take the week of November 13th then and review those proposals in our, what we would call a subcommittee. So representatives from HR, finance, IT will meet regularly to review the responses as they're coming in. Of course, then we have the Thanksgiving holiday in there, so we want to account for that. December 4th would be the week that we would invite the search firms in that we have narrowed down to our short list to do a demo and talk to us about their process. Our goal would be to provide you a final recommendation on January 8th. That means our deadline is December 26th, and so of course we want to account for the holiday season in there, vendors' abilities to be here and interview in person, and then of course taking our time to do our due diligence. Looking at then assuming an approval on the January 8th recommendation, that we would move forward right away, January 9th. And we think we are being conservative with the June 1st date. It sounds crazy that you would take 6 months, but obviously very important position. We want to make sure we make the right selection and do our complete phases of the search process. So we would be looking at June 1st as our final selection. And you have to take into consideration the possibility that you would do an external candidate that would need to give 30, 60-day notice as well. So again, a very conservative timeline. Any questions on that, or you want me to go ahead and wrap it up here? Okay.
Could I ask?
Yeah, sure.
You got on here a selection committee?
So when I refer to that, I'm referring to that subgroup of city staff. So HR representation.
Not council.
No,
Okay.
no, not at this point, because that would be the selection committee for the vendor, making recommendation to the council.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, yeah.
Let me, if I could just add, I've seen some councils take total control over this process, and you don't necessarily see some staff members kind of doing that. However, other councils have done this. So to me, it's just kind of a point of where this council is going to have to decide, are you involved in every step of the way or only certain steps? But again, that's a council decision you'll only want to make.
And if we could just on that clarify, you're talking about possibly not having the council involved in the initial proposal of who to hire as a firm.
Correct.
So we wouldn't necessarily have to be involved in that, but still be involved at every phase of the actual consideration of actual candidates who we might decide to hire.
Now, what we're highlighting for you this evening is getting us to the point that we have the executive search firm ready to roll, and then they will coordinate, I will coordinate with them, but they will lead the recruitment process, and you will be involved every step of the way.
I just wanted to clarify that that's kind of the essence of the distinction between, perhaps to the extent that it exists, it sometimes is blurred, between so-called policy making and politics and administration.
Correct.
Thank you.
Okay. And lastly, just to summarize very briefly for you what our next steps are, again, we will finalize that RFP to go out with procurement. We're already doing that. It's ready to go. As a matter of fact, Carla sent me an email about 5:30 with the draft based on what we had talked about earlier, so it is literally ready to go. And then HR would lead the coordination of the efforts to select the firm for the recruitment, and then of course you would be involved every step of the way after that.
Okay. All right. Questions? Alderwoman Schmidt.
A couple of questions. I I wondered, looking at the draft RFP, it seems like maybe we would want to include in here that we're a city manager form of government.
Okay.
Making sure that we are recruiting firms that work with that form of government. I think I'm not alone in having people ask, why do you have to hire a search firm to find a city manager?
Right.
And I think I know the answers to that, but maybe you could help us highlight the couple things where that puts us at an advantage.
Absolutely. Well, I will say right off the bat, we do have an HR exemption. You do not have to do an RFP. First of all, you do not have to do an RFP to find a vendor. We could literally go on our list, point to the one that we think would work best, and go with them. However, we don't think that's a fair approach. We want to make sure we are giving different firms the opportunity to submit their RFPs. Secondly, I will be 100% frank, it's about resources. We've got several other high-level positions becoming vacant that you know about. The Community Development Director, we will be recruiting for that. So that would be one area. Plus, it is widening our pool of applicants. So we believe going with an executive search firm, they're going to get at the potentially passive applicant that may not be out actively looking. And so I think it's going to help, number one, widen our pool, but number two, maybe get it a better quality than we could do with the resources we have in-house.
Thank you.
I think Alderwoman Schmidt asks an excellent question, and just to follow up and clarify, is there anyone on our staff who has ever had any extensive experience in hiring a city manager?
Looking at Steve, maybe Steve has.
I think the pause answers the question.
Right, not in
Yeah.
the HR department, I will say that. And me specifically, I've hired CEOs, so I could put, draw the parallel there, but a specific position as city manager, no.
Right.
Not that I'm
and
aware
it
of.
is certainly, in talking to Brad Cole from the Municipal League,
Right.
he's kind of walked me through the recent changes. 30 years ago when I was at the International City Management Association, even then, most metro cities hired search firms.
Mm-hmm.
And today, it's become even more.
They're the subject matter experts, and I would invite them
Right.
in to help with that recruitment. Obviously, it's our number one position, and we want to make sure we're...
And there still is, although it's much more attractive than it was in 1986 to 1988, that crappy ICMA newsletter where you have jobs listed, right? Almost nobody gets their job from there. And if we were a small town of 2,500 people or 3,500 people, nothing wrong with small towns of 2,500 or 3,500 people, we might even hire from within or locally. We might even put an ad in the Panagraph, depending on what it was we wanted. But when we've got a $215 million a year operation, you don't find those people off the streets.
Correct.
And so I just wanted to make that comment for the record, feeding on, that's obviously my much less delicate way of putting things than Alderwoman Schmidt. Alderwoman Howman.
Just a question I'm throw out. The town of Normal is also going through the same process, and they're using HR Gov. Would there be an advantage to our just using the same search firm because they know the community and...
We have discussed that. It's GovHR, Joellen and Heidi. Nope, I just wanted to clarify for the record. Joellen and Heidi are the two that we would work with before. They are on our list to reach out to as one definite potential that we want to respond to the RFP. And I would be happy to reach out to them and ask them if they think there's an advantage. My only concern with that being their process has already started. We would very potentially, be competing right in line with them. We may end up with number one. We may end up with number two. So I think it's worth the time and the effort to see what other search firms are out there that can, we would be their number one for this area.
And just to clarify with GovHR, is my understanding that didn't they get the national contract to hire the director of the ICMA?
That I don't know. Yes? Okay.
Okay. Yeah, and that's a huge plum for a firm that's not in Washington.
Right.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think Alderman Milwamway is next, but we'll come back to that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't have a thought on that, but I have a question. I am very interested in us being able to at least see a very diverse pool of candidates, from, just from, not just from a visual standpoint, but all aspects. So I was kind of curious. I read, the proposal, but I'm not quite sure at what point do you screen the search firms for that, or do you, once you select somebody, you select a search firm, then you talk them through what you're actually looking for?
I would say both. That's an excellent question and an excellent idea. We can definitely include that as one of our criterion in the RFP. And then when you're building that, once we've selected the vendor, when we're building our profile and working through our initial phases of the recruitment, we want to say that that is a priority for us. But we need to be able to define that for them as well, right? So when we get to that point, we want to be able to say, okay, council, what does diversity mean for you? So.
Any other points,
One
Alderwoman
more
Hammond?
thing. I think it was about a year ago that we did a exercise with Diane Crutcher about what we would be looking for in a city manager. So that would, I think, would be a good
That'd be a good resource. Mm-hmm.
for you.
Sure.
Okay. And if we could get copies of that, anything that we have from that for the council?
No.
No.
We just talked about the qualities of a city potential. If we were looking for a new city manager, what the qualities we were looking for, experience in economic development and ability to interact with the community at large. I mean, it was not specific, probably not as specific as a job description, but more the high level. High level, yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Okay. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it. And at this point, unless there's anything else, I would like a motion for us, and we were going to need to go into the fishbowl, to go into executive session for the purposes of discussing item 7A. Is there a motion?
I'll make that motion. And doesn't Jeff usually encourage us to include the verbiage that we're only going to be coming back to just adjourn?
We can adjourn from there.
Right, but isn't part of when we make these types of motions at the end of the meeting that we make
Yes,
it so that the
just so
only
that-
action taken is
Right.
that we're going to be adjourning at the end of it?
Right, just so that everybody understands, we are moving to the fishbowl, and we will come out of executive session, and the moment that we come out of executive session, we will have a motion to adjourn. So if you want to sit around and listen and wait till we actually adjourn, you are certainly welcome. And I'm staring at Maria because she's the only member of the media who's still here, and she probably could care less. But
So I make that
yeah,
motion.
the music is actually fabulous if you listen to that. So, but I do need a motion. I have a motion
Second.
by Alderman Scott Black, second by Alderwoman Diana Howman. And Madam, actually, we can just go ahead and vote on our screen here. Or no, we have to do a roll call on that one. I'm sorry, roll call on that one.
Alderman Bray,
Yes.
Alderman Matthews,
Yes.
Alderman Sage,
He just stepped out.
Yeah.
Alderman Malumway,
Yes.
Alderman Burgess,
Yes.
Alderman Painter,
Yes.
Alderman Schmidt,
Yes.
Alderman Black, Alderman Holman.
Yes.
Okay, we're at. Oh, and Cherry.